G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today I'm looking at what we've observed from preseason testing and how this implicates our F1 fantasy teams for the upcoming F1 season. So if you're new around here, you want to see more of this F1 fantasy content throughout the season, drop a like on the video and be sure to subscribe to the channel because there's going to be plenty more of this as we get to the start of the year. So I think what this video is intended to serve is kind of my interpretation of the timing, the results, the data from preseason testing, an assessment of just about every team, their performance, how they fared, what their teams think, and what this kind of means for our fantasy teams as well. So I think we'll get the elephant out of the room. Red Bull, no doubt the strongest team off the bat. Max looked excellent in that car across the sessions he was involved in. They looked faultless. They looked fast. They are the leading car. Obviously, Perez had a couple of mechanical gremlins, technical issues. He had a fire on the right brake on day 2. He didn't look quite as comfortable in the car as Max did, but they still booked 391 total laps. So I think exactly what they're hoping for from practice, and deservedly the favourite. That new car that Adrian Newey has completely turned around and delivered looks exceptionally quick, and I think they deserve to be the favourites in the constructors. So I'm really excited for Max and Checo and what that car can show us, but I think the gap between them and the rest of the competition has certainly closed from where we were 12 months ago. Ferrari, for me, are the biggest challenger to Red Bull. I think both their long run and their single lap pace is exceptionally strong. I think Leclerc and Sainz looked very good in the car, and their race simulations were almost 1.5 seconds faster than their 2023 Bahrain Grand Prix time. So I think the SF24 has been a major step forward, and Ferrari deserve to be competing for podiums week in, week out with a car that looks like this. They had the second most laps completed among all teams with 416, so I think that's really encouraging. They'll get a lot of data out of that they can analyze and interpret and obviously factor into how they design the car moving forward. But at the same time, I wouldn't read into single lap pace too much. The reason why I say that is because it is only testing, as cliched as it is. But we saw Joe put in a P3 on day 3, 3/10 behind Charles Leclerc. But that was, again, on a C4 compound. So if you're looking at these times without any context to the tyres, the fuel loads, it is probably a little bit misleading. But I still think in terms of tyres, Ferrari's biggest concern last year was their tyre degradation over an entire race. It looks as though they've really improved that. It's an encouraging sign because we could see from them last year that they were able to qualify well high up. Charles and Carlos had a number of pole positions, which unfortunately only converted to one race win. So if they're able to build on that and improve the tyre deg over an entire race, then I think they're going to be competing certainly for more wins than they were last season. But I think just behind Ferrari, I've got McLaren. They had a great first day, a great 3 days of testing, I mean to say. Norris, even though he lost an hour during one of his sessions, they had consistency. They didn't really set incredibly fast times, no headline times, but they chose not to run the C4 or the C5 tyre compound. And like I say, that tyre compound is obviously why we're seeing some of those midfield teams further up the timing charts. But I think they deserve to be confident. They have remained quite coy on what the McLaren for this season is going to look like, both through the car launch and through testing. And they weren't the only team that stuck to a racing program throughout the 3 days. Alpine, Aston Martin, for instance, were 2 other constructors that didn't really come in trying to set the world alight with single lap times. They just had data they needed to get and they got through what they needed to. And I think even though they have been quite guarded with what they expect from that car, I think they are going to be certainly fighting it out with Ferrari for P2. I think just behind, maybe a half step behind McLaren and Ferrari for me, is Mercedes. Again, a super productive 3 days of testing. Hamilton and Russell got a very high number of laps in. Russell in particular, as you can see here on the screen, P2, 4/100ths off Charles for P1. But James Allison has said they're expecting decent long run pace from this Mercedes. The baseline from where the car is this season to last season is obviously a big step forward for them. They're just concerned that single lap pace could be a little bit behind Ferrari and McLaren. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see Mercedes kind of P5 to P7, P6 to P8 in qualifying. from the Bahrain Grand Prix. But I think going back to that car baseline they've got, last season we only saw Mercedes lock in one podium between Bahrain and Monaco. It was the second half of the season they managed to take more steps forward in terms of development. And so I think they're going to be a much more consistent and competitive outfit out of the gates. They're going to be in the mix for, I think, more podiums early on. Whether or not they're able to convert that to consistent podiums through Hamilton and Russell is another thing altogether. Even though I think they are going to be fighting for P2, right now I've got them as P4 in the Constructors. But a lot can change, as we saw with McLaren last year, over an entire season. So one eye on Mercedes to see whether or not they can make some big strides in the new year. Aston Martin, for me, again, another half step behind Mercedes. They were another team that were quite guarded with their what they wanted to show in testing. Alonso looked very quick, I will say, even though his timings didn't look by any means earth-shattering. P8 on the first day of testing. Where was he? P12, and then back P8. So nothing amazing, as I said. The tyre compounds, the fuel loads affect kind of a lot of where the drivers factor into the timing charts. Do I see them being faster than Mercedes? Maybe. I wouldn't say they're an absolute lock to be faster than the Silver Arrows, but I think they have got the makings of a strong car. That talk about that new factory, obviously, that they're working with. And I think Alonso, in his own right, is on his day going to be a driver that can push for podiums. Stroll, on the other hand, much like the Perez in that Red Bull, the second driver, is he going to do enough to lift Aston Martin in the Constructors? He really didn't take on a lot of a burden last year, and I worry that it could be the same story into 2024. So if Stroll can unearth some solid drives, then maybe he had a couple of really consistent outings late last year, but you want to see that over a full season and not just a couple of races to be optimistic about Aston Martin. RB, the rebranded AlphaTauri outfit, they look solid. Nothing amazing. I thought Ricciardo had a couple of really impressive single laps throughout the 3 days of testing. He featured P4 for a single lap on day one, P5 on the second day. But they were overall quite middling. I think I was expecting them to push and rival Aston Martin in the midfield for P5. I think they're probably just off the pace, but I also think they're well ahead of the Williams. So they're kind of sitting in no man's land at the moment for me. But I think the Red Bull components that they're taking on board this year will certainly help the car move forward. I really like that Ricciardo and Tsunoda driver pairing. So I think they'll be a solid midfield outfit and expected to contend for points every single week. Williams, they had a bit of a mixed couple of days. Albon did his usual stuff, someone we know what to expect from. Sargent, on the other hand, was really struggling. He lost control of the car at one point. They had reliability concerns. They were struggling with rebalancing the car. The quick runs, I thought, every so often looked quite solid, certainly on day 3 as they made progress over those couple of days. But I thought it just took a little bit of time for them to ease into the testing routine. And I'm curious to see whether or not they're going to be out in Q1 often. Haas and Sauber, I think, are going to be two teams that really do struggle. But Williams, I think Albon's going to be able to do enough to make the odd Q3 appearance. We know what to expect from him. So I think they'll sit behind RB, but maybe just ahead of Alpine. And Alpine, they went from very optimistic to now managing expectations. Another team that stuck to their testing program, didn't run the C4 or the C5, but a lot of their laps were run with higher fuel loads for longer run simulations. They didn't want to show their full hand, and they just went methodically through the plan that they had in mind. Most interestingly to me, and I know I keep harping on about those single lap times, Alpine's fastest time across the 3 days of testing was actually slower than Haas's fastest time set by Nico Hülkenberg. So I do worry if in qualifying Alpine do struggle, but then over an entire race they're able to make up some ground. I know Gasly and Ocon are very experienced drivers, but obviously the car factors into how the team goes as well on the weekend. So let's wait and see what we get from Alpine, but I wouldn't say their stock is flying for them at the moment. And then Sauber and Haas, they're going to be propping up the bottom of the table for me. Neither team really set the world on fire these last few days. Not many reliable runs from Sauber. Obviously, I think Joe here, P3, again, he was running the C4, so maybe not fully representative of what to expect from them. But their headline times on day 2 were competitive. Nothing groundbreaking again, but I think they just kind of wanted to go through the motions, get the data they needed, but I still think that car's just not going to be able to do enough. Nothing inspiring from Bottas, and nothing to suggest he's going to be on my radar as a fantasy asset. And then Haas at the bottom. They had the most laps of all constructors, interestingly enough, but I think they're going to be fighting it out with Sauber at the bottom. So I guess, what does that mean for our F1 fantasy teams now? In the lead up to testing, this was my team. I'd just gone through a number of different reasons why I wanted this particular build, and if the game started tomorrow, I may well still go with this lineup. Ferrari, I think, answered a lot of the concerns or things I wanted clarified from testing. I'm really encouraged by the performance of the Ferrari, and Max, understandably, the 2 times deserves to be, even at 30 million, he's the number 1 name in my team. I think if I chose not to go with this build, it would be a Red Bull Constructor RB 1-2 punch. But what is Perez going to show us in practice and in qualifying? I'm really not sure. That's probably the main reason why I would pivot between either Red Bull or Ferrari. If I'm encouraged by Checo, then I think that becomes a very easy decision for me to make. But if Sainz and Leclerc are up there with Verstappen in qualifying, or in practice, I mean to say, then maybe I edge with the Ferrari. If I was to then sacrifice Leclerc in favor of the Red Bull Constructor, that would mean going all the way down to Stroll or Ricciardo. I wouldn't say either one is particularly better or worse than the other, but I do think that there is probably a case to be made for Lance Stroll if he's able to replicate his late season form last season. The other thing I would argue, though, in favour of Daniel is the extra $1.8 million in cost cap to spare. Roll it over to the next week. If we need a bit of budget flexibility once those price rises come through, that might help a little bit if we need to move up or down, depending on how our race results shake out. But people have also asked me why, in your previous build with Ferrari, if I just bring that one back up, would you go Ricciardo over Yuki Tsunoda? And the reason why I say that is purely because I think Tsunoda and Ricciardo are the 2 most evenly matched drivers at that price point, despite $1 million in price difference. The problem is, if I go for Ricciardo instead of Tsunoda, that means I have to move away from Gasly or Albon. So hypothetically, let's say I go for Ricciardo in this slot. That only leaves me with 6.3 million, which is either Kevin Magnussen or Logan Sargent. I am not inspired by either of those 2 choices. Sargent's got that consistency concern we saw last season. Kevin Magnussen, I don't think, is going to finish anywhere above P18 in the Drivers' Championship, and doesn't seem to inspire me any confidence with qualifying. The fact that Haas race pace last season was solid. Haas qualifying pace was solid. Race pace, not so great. I just worry if K-Mag can't even outperform a P16 or a P15 in qualifying, what that means for him over the entire race weekend. So that's why if I'm toing and froing between Ricciardo and Tsunoda, I don't think the gulf between those 2 drivers is that significant, which is why I'm leaning towards Tsunoda at the moment in that slot. But I am toing and froing between the Ferrari and the Red Bull Constructor build. I think they're both, the case can be made equally for both of them as for which option, but I think, as I said before, how Checo looks in practice next week is going to largely factor into my decision making for whether or not I choose to go Red Bull or Ferrari there. I was just really encouraged by what we saw from Sainz and Charles over days 2 and 3 of testing. So I think right now this is where my head's at. I could also go to Sainz if I wanted to, which gives me 0.9 to upgrade Albon to, say, an Esteban Ocon. I'm not so sure yet, again, what to expect from Alpine. As I said before, they kept their cards very close to their chest, and whether or not they're expected to do that well. And I think I know what to expect from Gasly, Ocon and Albon, all very experienced drivers. But right now, it's way too early in the season for me to confidently say I like one driver over another. I'd want to see practice, and I'd want to see consistent results from one of these 2 drivers or one of these 3 drivers to choose one over the other. But look, go with your gut realistically if you had to make a decision. But I'll be back with a lot more information and videos in the lead up to practice and the Bahrain Grand Prix next weekend. So I thought I'd just leave it there, guys. As I said, lots more fantasy content to come in the lead up to the first race week of the season and throughout the 2024 F1 calendar. So if you're new around here, as I said at the start of the video, you like seeing this kind of content, drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. But I think I'll leave it there for now, guys. I appreciate you dropping by, and I'll see you all very soon.